Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Speaking of Oats webinar today. I'm Charlene White, and I'm here today in my capacity as editor of the Oat newsletter. And normally you'd be seeing Pablo Oliveira Firpo, but he's not available today. Now, Pablo, of course, is the director of Oat Global, and Oat Global is a public-private partnership that aims to coordinate and connect oat researchers and oat extension professionals worldwide with each other and with individuals from along the entire oat value chain. So we're very glad that you're here today. And before I introduce today's speaker, though, I'd like to remind you to please use the Q&A box to ask any questions. And you can do that throughout the webinar. Please do not use the chat box because using the Q&A box, well, it's easier for us, but also it allows us to keep a record of what was asked for later on. So please note too that today's session is being recorded, and we will be making the recording available both on YouTube and on the newsletter site as well. So our speaker today is Sarah Clarke from ADAS in the UK, and the title of her talk is Understanding UK Oats, Physiology and Nutrition. So Sarah, thank you very much for being here today. And now I'll pass things over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Charlene. And good morning or afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to be here today and be able to talk to you. As Charlene mentioned, I'm going to be talking about UK oats and physiology and nutrition. So my name is Sarah Clarke. I'm a crop physiologist based in the UK. I have been doing work on oat physiology and agronomy for quite a few years now, and I do very applied research which is directly applicable to farmers, and I work a lot with farmers to help them understand their crops and their yields. The company I work for is ADAS. So we're a UK-wide company. We're the largest privately owned research and consultancy organisation for agriculture and the environment in the UK. And we cover a lot of different disciplines in agriculture and the environment, over 60 different ones. So we have a wide breadth of knowledge about all aspects of agriculture, and the work that we do is very applied to farmers. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background about oats in the UK and how it's grown and how much is grown, just to give you a flavour of what's happening in this country. So if you look at oats in the UK, it's the third most important cereal crop by area. So you can see the areas here in the table. So there's about 200,000 hectares of oats grown every year. This does fluctuate a bit, and it has been increasing over the last 20 years or so. It's a relatively small crop compared to wheat at 1.8 million hectares and barley at 1.1 million hectares. So we have winter and spring oats that we grow in the UK, and we grow these in different regions for different reasons. So Scotland, up in the north of the map there, are very good at growing spring oats, and historically they've done mostly spring oats up there. Growers are increasingly growing some winter oats, and they're growing some spring oats drilled in the winter as well. There are also another spring oats growing region down in the East Anglia, and that is for a very different reason. Growers in that region suffer quite a lot from blackgrass weed issues, which means that they want a spring cropping option so that they can avoid those weeds. So they're a big spring oat growing region too. The rest of the country predominantly grows winter oats, and that's because winter oats generally have better milling quality. In the UK, the majority of oats that we grow both winter and spring are husked oats. There are some naked oats grown, but it's a relatively minor area, and you have to have a particular contract for growing naked oats. Milling is the most important market for oats in the UK, but actually as the oats area is growing, so is the market for feed oats as well. So we do have an increasing market for that. We find that yields vary hugely. If you look at the government statistics, which are released by DEFRA, the relevant government department, the average oats yield is around 5.5 tonnes per hectare. But actually, we see growers which are achieving more like 10 tonnes per hectare. So they do vary a lot. And that's one of the reasons we are trying to improve yields through research. So in the UK, both the consumption and the production of oats has been increasing over the past 20 years. We're seeing a lot more oats products available in the supermarket, from hot oat cereal, porridges, granolas, muesli, and also some savoury oats products which are now coming onto the market. This increase in demand is set to continue. There's a new oats mill being built as we speak, so that will increase the capacity too. And there's also an increasing demand for oat drink products as well. However, over the last however many years, oats hasn't been researched very much compared to other cereals like wheat and barley. And it was very comforting to hear at the International Oats Conference that other people are also struggling to find funding for oats research. It's a real challenge, but I'm hoping that we're starting to address that. There are lots of fundamental knowledge gaps that we see both in physiology and also agronomy research, which really need addressing. It means that growers don't have the confidence or the tools to be able to achieve the optimum yields and milling quality they could achieve, and which means that there is a sort of limit on the amount of oats that could be grown. We're starting to address some of these knowledge gaps. We've carried out recent research on physiology, leading to the first oat growth guide, which I'll talk a little bit about now. Plus, we've been carrying out projects on agronomy, such as nitrogen and sulfur nutrition. So just to talk briefly about some of the work we've done on physiology. This is the Optia Oat project, and I did talk a bit about this at the International Oats Conference. I'm not going to cover all the details again today, but if anybody would like more information, they're welcome to contact me, or they can look back at the Oats Conference abstracts. So this project was led by PepsiCo, and it was an Innovate funded project, which means that it's funded half by government and half by industry. So ADAS were one of the partners in that project, along with the other partners that you can see here. And it was a project that was really important for oat growers. We were developing a number of different aspects. The first was looking at using UAS, or unmanned aerial systems, or drones for field monitoring. Also developing decision support tools for oat growers. And what I'm going to talk about a bit more is developing an oat growth guide. In the UK, we already have a wheat and barley and oilseed rape growth guide, which looks at the development and growth benchmarks for those crops in the UK. But until now, we haven't had one for oats. So it's a big step forward. So what we did in this project, we looked at both winter and spring sown oats. So the winter sown oats is Mascani, and that variety is the most popular variety for millers. And so it's the most popular winter oat variety that's still grown. It's been around for quite a few years now, but it's so consistent in its performance that it's still grown very widely. We also looked at the spring oat variety Canyon, which is one of the spring oats available in the UK. We had 4 seasons of trials between 2014 and 2017, and 5 sites across England, Scotland and Wales. So the blue squares in the map, on the map that you can see on the right hand side there, those are the reference sites. So those were the very detailed experiments that we carried out. We also had sites in the north and the south, and the line you can see there is the border between those 2 regions. For the reference sites, we had 4 replicate plots per variety per site, so that we could make sure that we were confident in the results that we were getting. And we had dedicated measurements and yield plots. So when we were doing destructive yields, that didn't affect any of the other plots. As well as having the reference crop sites, we also monitored commercial crops, and the red dots on the map you can see on the right there show the different Mascani and Canyon commercial crops that were monitored throughout the project. It was monitoring not in quite as much detail as the reference sites, as you can imagine, but it gave us some really good information at key growth stages. So we carried out a lot of measurements on the winter and the spring reference crops at various different growth stages throughout the development of the crops, from growth stage 30, the start of stem extension, right up to growth stage 87 at the end of grain filling. And you can see all the different measurements that we took, information about dates, so we could look at the development of the crop through thermal time, biomass, the green area index or GAI, nitrogen uptake, tiller number and height, as well as things like yield, harvest index and grain quality, which we measured after harvest. So from all those detailed metrics that we measured, we developed benchmarks for both winter and for spring oats in the UK. So what do I mean by a benchmark? A benchmark, as we see it in this context, is a numerical value that describes the growth and development of a crop. So we have growth and development benchmarks for the whole life cycle of winter and spring oats, which are associated with a benchmark yield. So if you add up all those individual metrics, you will get to that benchmark yield. I'm not going to talk in detail about all the results that we got from this, because that was the subject of my paper for the conference. But I'm going to talk a bit more about how we can use the benchmarks that we've developed using the Oat Growth Guide. And benchmarking can be used by growers to understand their crop and the yield and the quality they're getting. And the way that we're doing that now in the UK is through the Yield Enhancement Network for oats. So this is an initiative that ADAS set up 10 years ago to understand what is happening with different crops. It was initially set up for wheat, but now we have a huge range of different yen networks, of which one is oats. So the yen, or the yield enhancement, was established to identify arable innovators and support their innovation so they can achieve better yields and quality. And the way that we do that, we have a competition. So some growers are really excited to try and win the highest yield in each of these competitions. And we look at absolute yield, but also the proportion of their potential yield as different competitions. We do a lot of analysis. The Yen report that you can see on the right-hand side there, it's a 24-page report with over 100 metrics, all describing their crop yield, growth, development, and quality. So you can imagine it's quite comprehensive. We also have a networking element where farmers can share ideas and then can go ahead and test their ideas of how they can enhance their yields and quality. So the first year of the Oats Yen was in 2021. We have oats specific reports. So previously oats were lumped in with all the other cereals, but now we have oats specific benchmarks, oats specific yields, oats specific potential yields as well, so that oat growers can have the confidence that they're being compared with other like-for-like crops. There's a lot of information that's collected for the Yen projects for each of the competitions. We go through everything from soil descriptions, agronomy, leaf measurements, leaf nutrients. We look at the number of panicles per metre squared. We take grab samples. I realise that's a wheat crop. Apologies, it's not oats. We also look at the harvested area and weight so that we can get a calibrated yield. We have the agronomy details and the weather, and all this information feeds into the Yen reports for the growers. We also calculate potential yields. And the way that we do this is that we look at the light that is available to a particular crop, the amount that can be captured by that crop, and also the conversion. And then we look at the water that is available to that crop, the amount that can be captured through that soil type, and the rooting that's available, and the conversion into yield. So from those information, we are able to calculate potential yields across the country based on the weather data and the soil type. And this map here gives you the potential yields that we've calculated. This was for 2021. We have done it again for 2022, but we haven't had the results awards evening yet for the Yen this year. So I haven't stolen any thunder by showing the 2022 data. So these were the potential yields that we calculated for 2021, and you can see they range from below 12 tonnes per hectare to over 17.4 tonnes per hectare. We're not saying that these are necessarily definitely achievable every year, but they are the potential yields if you look at the physiology of the crop and what could, in theory, be achieved. We then look at the benchmarking of the different metrics that we calculate. So for a lot of different metrics, so yield, panicles per metre squared, and lots of different metrics throughout the season, we have this benchmarking box and whisker chart, we call it. So the box in the middle contains the middle 50% of Yen values. The middle line is the median value. And then we have the whiskers going out the sides, which show the range. So this gives you an idea of the distribution of the data for each metric. We also display the benchmark where we have it for both the spring oats and the winter oats. and then the entrance particular value is displayed on the orange line. So I'm just going to talk a bit about how we could interpret one of the yen entries that we had last year. It was an entry of the spring oat variety Conway, and it achieved a yield of 8.3 tonnes per hectare. Generally, we saw in 2021 that cereal yields were relatively low, and oat yields, you can see most of the oat yields sat between the benchmarks. So the green line is the spring oat benchmark, and the blue line on this chart is the winter oat benchmark. And the majority of the entries sat in that box in between those. But this entry achieved 8.3 tonnes per hectare, which is higher than the winter oat benchmark yield, let alone the spring oat one. We saw that in 2021, generally crops had low biomass and a high harvest index. However, if you look at this Conway crops biomass, you can see that it achieved a higher biomass than the green spring oats biomass benchmark. And also it's achieved a very high harvest index. When we look at interpreting the yields, we first look at the yield components. So the panicles per metre squared, grains per panicle, and 1,000 grain weight. We saw in 2021 that actually generally 1,000 grain weights were low, which is very different to what we saw this year in 2022. This entry of Conway in 2021 had a low 1,000 grain weight, but a very good specific weight. And you can see that one of the reasons why 1,000 grain weights were low is that we had a dull August. So that's when the grain would have been filling. This is an anomaly map. So grayer means duller. When we look at all the data together, we can see that the high yield of Conway was a result of a high number of grains per metre squared, a lot higher than the majority of the entries and also the benchmarks. When we're thinking about what we can do to increase yields and quality, nitrogen fertilizer is a big influencer of that. So I'm just going to talk a bit about nitrogen and the work we've done there. We find that optimizing nitrogen in oats is a bit of a balancing act, really, because it does affect plant architecture, which does increase yield, but unfortunately it does also, or can also, reduce some aspects of quality. So we see that when we increase nitrogen, we generally get an increased number of grains per metre squared, so an increase in panicle numbers and also increase of grain numbers per panicle. But unfortunately, this sometimes means that the 1,000 grain weight is reduced, the screenings are increased, and the specific weight is reduced. We needed a project in the UK to look at the most appropriate nitrogen regimes for both quality and yield. So this is what's known as the Notes project, which finished last year, led by ADAS, but also with Catherine Howarth at Aberystwyth University, who led the quality aspect of this project. We're also lucky enough to have lots of different contributions from throughout the oat supply chain, which was really helpful. So we were aiming to provide advice on the most appropriate nitrogen rates and timings, plus sulfur applications to optimize both yield and, importantly, milling quality. And that was also looking at winter and spring oats. So we had a number of trial sites. The green dots here show where we had our core sites. the spring oat sites in Scotland and in the east, and then winter oat sites in the east and the west. And we additionally had contributions from Aberystwyth and also Tegus in Ireland. I'm not going to share all the data because I don't have time, unfortunately, but I just wanted to share some of the findings that we found looking at the core note sites, but also the additional trials that we'd gathered data from. So this table showed you the average recommended rate from the nutrient management guide known as RB209 in the UK. The average recommended rate, the actual optimum N rate or N-opt that we found from experiments, and the average yield. So you can see that the average recommended rate for both the core sites and the additional trials were pretty similar on average. So 175 and 168 kilos of N per hectare. However, for the core note sites, we found the actual optimum N rates were really low. The reasons for this, for the winter oats trials, the trials in Herefordshire suffered from a lot of lodging, and the trials in Nottinghamshire had very sandy soils and very dry springs, which led to very few grains per panicle. What we did find, though, that was there was a significant relationship between the yield at the optimum N rate and the optimum N rate, so which made us think that there should be some adjustments to N rate based on yield, which isn't currently in the current recommendations. These graphs are from Catherine, looking at the effect of nitrogen rate on quality. So the x-axis on both of these graphs looks at the amount of nitrogen applied. The graph on the left shows the relationship with specific weight and kernel content, and these relationships are pretty similar to ones we've found in previous projects, where as you increase N rate, you generally get a reduction in specific weight, although generally it doesn't go below what the threshold is for milling. And then the graph on the right looks at screenings and 1,000 grain weight, and you can see that generally as you increase nitrogen rate, the screenings are increased, although again it doesn't hit the threshold where it would be an issue for milling quality. Variety has a big impact on quality. This graph shows the relationship between the amount of nitrogen applied and specific weight. For Mascani and for Southwark, then the specific weight is maintained a lot better at higher N rates than for Penrose. But overall, that we saw that Mascani was much more stable in all its grain quality parameters over different N rates. We also looked at nitrogen timings. So in this graph, the bar on the left represents the yield when timings were applied as per the current recommendations. So some at tillering, growth stage 25, and then the rest split between growth stage 30 and 32. And you can see that actually the current recommendations are pretty appropriate for maximizing yield. We found that nitrogen at tillering, so that top row, so the first, second, fourth and sixth had nitrogen at tillering, and that was pretty important for both yield and quality. The bar on the right didn't have any sulfur, and you can see that the yield had been impacted by a lack of sulfur. And this was particularly evident on the sites where there's light soils. However, Catherine didn't find that any impact on quality. So overall, the current timings in the current recommendations gave the highest 1,000 grain weight nitrogen uptake and nitrogen fertilizer recovery. Looking at the spring oats results from the same set of experiments, the average recommended nitrogen rate was about 128 and 122 kilos of N per hectare for the core and the additional trials, whereas the actual optimum N rates were about 30 kilos of N per hectare higher. And you can see also that the ranges were a lot greater. I think that there is certainly a reason to up the current recommended rates in the current version of RB209. We're waiting to hear what the recommendations will be coming out this year. When Catherine looked at the quality aspects, we had trials up in Scotland and with trials in East Anglia. So the left-hand side graph shows the relationship between nitrogen applied and specific weight and kernel content in Scotland, and the right-hand side one shows the same in East Anglia. And you can see that the y-axis scales are quite different. So the ones in Scotland generally had higher specific weight, but the relationships were similar and the same as with the winter oats. So you're having lower specific weights as you're increasing your nitrogen applied. So just to conclude, we have made some progress in understanding both oats physiology and with the Oats Growth Guide, and that is now freely available online that anybody can download. We are also using that information from the Oat Growth Guide in the Oats Yen to help growers understand how yields are formed and also understand their quality. And also importantly, that understanding will help them develop strategies for improvement. We found that optimizing fertilizer strategies is quite a balancing act, and it depends on variety, soil types, and water availability. There are many other areas of both physiology and agronomy that need additional research. So if anybody who's joined this webinar is interested to collaborate, that would be excellent. We're always looking for new projects on oats, which there could be many. Thank you very much for your attention. These are my contact details. So if anybody would like to get in touch, please feel free. Otherwise, you can catch me on Twitter, talking about oats often. But thank you again. And if anybody has any questions on anything I've covered, please feel free to ask.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation. You're looking at an awful lot of different things. I'm quite excited about all the different characters and so on and so forth that you're looking at in that work. We have one question in the Q&A box so far from Sissy Zechner, and she's asking 200,000 hectares. How much of this is spring and how much winter oats in the UK?
It varies a bit by region. So in Scotland, more will be spring oats than winter oats. In East Anglia, more will be spring than winter oats, but in the rest of the country, more will be winter than spring.
Great. And yes, if others would like to pop some questions in the box, we can have Sarah answer those. Lucia Gutierrez has put a comment in the chat saying, Sarah, excellent presentation and impressive work. It certainly is. And I'd also like to point out that I've noticed that there are quite a few oat breeders on the call today. So one of the questions generally, I guess, I tend to have, because of my biases and so on, is what happened. I know you have looked at certain different varieties and so on, but let's try to be a little bit more specific. Perhaps for the yen, for example, when the farmers and people are competing, do people tend to use the same varieties? What happens with that? Are there restrictions on the varieties?
No, anybody can enter any crop of into yen. It could be any variety. And although it is a competition, it's really more to me about understanding the crop. So if they're keen to understand what's going on with that particular crop, they can enter that crop. So any variety is a possibility. We did look for the both the projects that I described. We did have a limited number of varieties that we looked at. Muscani is the most popular winter oat variety for millers and also for growers, but there are some new varieties coming through. I think certainly the varieties we see in the UK some of these benchmarks that we find in the UK wouldn't necessarily translate exactly to other countries, because obviously conditions are very different and varieties perform differently. I have seen some results where we've looked at performance of varieties crossing borders, and they haven't performed quite so well. So I think that some of the varieties that are adapted here and there's some of the benchmarks that we see here wouldn't necessarily translate, but I think in some of the principles that we found in understanding the oat physiology would be relevant, and some of the way we calculate potential yields, differences between wheat and oats, for example, would also be relevant.
Yeah, calculating the potential yield, to me, that's fascinating how you do that. And perhaps in a minute you can talk about that a little bit, but there are some other questions here I'll just put to you first so I don't hog the floor. So Stakman-Borlaug would like to know, you mentioned an increasing demand for feed oats in the UK. What is the reason for it and how is it used?
Well, I think in a way it's a byproduct of the general oat market increasing. Until quite recently, I think the oat market in the UK was a bit dysfunctional, where if you didn't hit the milling specification, your grain was not worth very much. But now there is a bit more of a functional market where there is oats being fed to livestock. Naked oats are obviously better for poultry. We've seen that a lot. But the husked oats aren't being fed to cattle.
Right, yeah. Okay, great, thank you. An anonymous attendee says, thank you for your excellent presentation. Does your research continue on to food processing research? So I guess to do with the quality of the oats.
No, I mean, we do in the projects that I'm involved with, we do look at the different specifications that I've described, so specific weight, 1,000 grain weight, kernel content and hullability. We do look at protein concentration as well, but we haven't taken it further into other sort of test milling, etc. Although part of the OptiOat project that I described at the beginning did do some test milling from some of those monitored crops. But yeah, it would be very interesting. I'd be very interested to do more work, more in that direction.
Great, and yeah, people can feel free to get in touch with you, as you said.
Please
Your
do.
contact info is still there on the screen, so that's great. Okay, thank you. So Lucia has some questions now. So to continue with Charlene's ideas, most small grain varieties respond a little different to management. How much of the genotype by management do you think there is? What would the scale or magnitude of those interactions be? And how much can those affect specific recommendations?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we do those are very important interactions, and those at the same time as we were doing this work on fertilizer management in oats, we were also carrying out work on spring barley as well. And although some of the recommendations overlapped, for example, in spring barley as well as spring oats, there was an importance of applying some nitrogen in the seedbed. Other aspects differed. So I think that is very important. When we're thinking about managing oats, because of the panicle and the structure of the panicle and the potential to form tertiary grains in certain varieties, that's going to affect the management as well. So I think it's quite important for growers to sort of learn how to grow their variety that they've chosen, because they do perform quite differently and form yields in different ways. I think for oats, it's quite important because of the issues with specific weight and screenings that we see sometimes. It's quite important to not form too many grains, but make sure that the grains that you have formed are filled properly. And it's understanding the best way to do that.
Right. I guess this also relates too to, a lot of producers don't like to up and change varieties, once they've been working with a variety that's suited to them. Because
Yeah.
they have optimized a lot of these things, and switching varieties too, there's a lot of risk associated with that.
Yeah, and I think often millers are very set on particular varieties, and they don't necessarily like changing either. So when the millers are saying, I want this one, the growers can't necessarily change to a new improved version.
Yeah, good point. Okay, thank you. So Stefan has another question. Did you analyze the change of proteins in the sulfur fertilized trial variants? Probably there will be some consequences to proteins as well, if, I guess, protein level as well, if additional sulfur is applied to the crop.
Yeah, that is a good point. We didn't in the notes project that I described, but in the oats yam, we do look at grain nitrogen, grain sulfur, and the nitrogen sulfur ratio. So we are looking at those aspects too. Yes, it is right that as you're changing sulfur, and the nitrogen sulfur ratio is very important in different protein formations. So we do look at that in yen, but we really need some more data in the yen to be able to analyze it all together to understand exactly what's going on.
Okay, great, thank you. Sissy has another question as well. Is there an interest in organic grown oats in the UK?
Yes. Before I worked for ADAS, I actually worked for the Organic Research Centre, and I saw some very high yields of oats grown organically, really impressive. And there are certainly some millers are contracting for organic oats. So yeah, organic oats, I think, do perform really well. And so there is various bits of research ongoing at the moment with organic oat crops. And I think that is of interest to some millers.
Yes, I think so for sure. And Jennifer Mitchell Fetch asks, when a new cultivar is released, would you already have information available for the potential performance, yields, and quality traits around the entire UK for that cultivar?
Well, in the UK, we have a system called the recommended list system. So before a cultivar is approved and recommended, it's approved through the value for cultivation use for ECU as well as DUS system. But then we have a recommended list system on top of that, where we gather quite a lot of data on both the yield and the quality performance and through trials throughout the UK. So yes, there will be information on those different varieties in terms of their performance. Whether there isn't any nitrogen treatments in those trials, but there's certainly a lot of information that we get on how they perform in terms of quality, disease resistance, lodging, height, and things like that.
Good, thank you. That's it for the Q&A box right now. There is a comment in the chat from Juan Dietz. Sarah, very interesting work using winter and spring oats. In Argentina, we are studying the impact of crown rust on nitrogen remobilization. And actually, this brings up another question too. You can comment on that, but also I'm wondering about the impacts too of using, fungicides and different things. And I mean, the whole disease situation in the UK. Could you comment on that too?
Yeah, so yeah, crown rust is an issue in the UK, and also mildew. They're generally quite easily controlled, quite cheaply with fungicides. In all the work that we've carried out, we've tried to exclude all disease. So that shouldn't have been interacting with any of the effects that we saw. However, I think that the use of fungicides can be quite important for oats in maintaining green leaf area for as long as possible, which will maintain grain filling. I think sometimes in oats, because they don't suffer very much from disease, and because it's easily controlled, people don't apply very much fungicides. And so grain filling, sometimes the life of the canopy isn't extended as long as it could be. If the canopy life was extended further, either through fungicides or other methods, maybe a bit of late nitrogen, you could potentially see better grain quality, because you're getting more grain filling, higher 1,000 grain weight and higher specific weight. So I think that's one on my list that I would like to research.
Right. It seems to me you must have a very long list.
I have a huge list.
So again, everybody, we need more cooperators, more people to work with Sarah on this important work. So you mentioned the weeds and so on as well. What do people usually do for weed control and so on? How is that?
Yeah, cereal weed control is difficult in oats in the UK. As I mentioned, if people have blackgrass issues, they mostly go to spring cropping so that they can control the blackgrass through stale seed beds. There is some chemistry available for pre-emergence herbicides for weed control in the autumn if people are growing oats in the autumn, but that is one of the biggest questions I always get asked, is about weed control in oats, and it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure how big the problem really is here in North America. Someone could perhaps enlighten me at some point. But I don't think it's nearly as bad as from what I've heard in the UK. Yes, I'm on Twitter as well, of course, at Oat Newsletter. And so following, it's really interesting that, I mean, you are interacting so well with all the producers, the farmers and so on, because of course, yes, there's no point in the rest of us doing any of this work if we have nobody to grow the crop, right?
Yeah.
And they can't. get good returns and so on from the crops. So yeah, no, that you've given us so much fascinating information today. This is great. Um, I'm wondering a little bit more about calculating that yield potential. I mean, it used to be, in the molecular marker world, we were told, oh, find some markers for yield, that will help the breeders develop new varieties, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, obviously quantitative trait and because, oh, we have this many QTL for yield.
Yeah.
It's great. But of course, yield isn't one thing. There's so many different components to
Yeah.
yield. And what
Yeah.
makes this potential yield?
Yeah, I mean, we think about it in a well, it's very physiological, and it's a relatively simple model that we use. So we look at just light and water availability, capture and conversion, and we have crop metrics that we use to understand what could be the potential. We have soil metrics that we use to understand what could be the potential water available. We have a sort of standard green area index curve where we look at how much light could be captured, and then we use things like radiation use efficiency, an extinction coefficient, which is different from oats to wheat, to calculate those yield potentials. So we can't it has to be done in hindsight because we need all the weather data to understand what happened in that season. We don't use this to predict yields. And as I said, it is a potential yield if you got all these things that we do see in different crops. If you manage to achieve all of those things and had perfect agronomy, then you may be able to achieve those. This year, we've seen, certainly for wheat crops, because usually we see that the potential yields are light limited, but this year we've seen the potential yields being water limited. And we've found that actually some growers are achieving their potential yields and sometimes a bit more than what we predicted as their potential yields. So they've obviously managed to capture all the water that's been available by good rooting, good soil structure, etc. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, yeah, it's just worth remembering that we're not saying it's everybody could achieve this. It's physiologically, if you manage to get all those things right and had great agronomy and had the resources in terms of light and water, that's what you could get.
Right. So you need all your ducks in a row and all the stars to align, which of course, yeah, it never happens.
Yeah.
There's one, I guess, maybe one last question here from Sissy again. In order to get these top possible yields, you told us, what would be the amount of nitrogen a farmer should apply, growth regulators, and which pesticides would be necessary?
Yeah, so in terms of growth regulators are quite important, certainly in some areas of the country, to prevent lodging. And I think a sort of split program of a couple of growth regulators at the optimum time, certainly in the UK, would need to be applied. The amount of nitrogen fertilizer, it's quite hard to say how much nitrogen fertilizer should be applied, because obviously it depends on how much fertilizer, how many nitrogen is in your crop, and then we can work out what potentially the crop could take up. We do have benchmarks for nitrogen uptake in the oat growth guide as well, but we're seeing some growers are, well, some of the optimum N rates we're seeing are over 200 kilos of N per hectare, and whereas others are a lot lower. So it very much depends on the situation. In terms of other weed control, as we've talked about, and fungicides, as we've talked about, but yes, PGI use is important. in the UK. But then we also have for spring crops, PGR use can be quite difficult because spring crops sort of race through some of their growth stages. So getting it on at the right time can be also tricky. So it's not an easy thing to do necessarily.
That's true, because winter oats are growing over a much longer time period.
Yeah.
Actually, I thought of one more little question from me. Do the growers and so on who participate, do they take soil samples, or does somebody go and actually take soil samples for amounts of nitrogen and so on, or?
Yeah, so we have two ways that they assess how much nitrogen is in the soil. One is called the field assessment method. So that uses your information about your previous crop, your soil type, the amount of overwinter rainfall that you get, and also how much nitrogen is currently in the crop if you've got a winter crop. So we assess that in the spring. So that's one way of estimating it. The other way is to measure the nitrogen in the soil, and growers do that. Not all growers do that, but growers often measure the nitrogen in their soil. Yeah.
Okay, super. And we'll sneak in actually one last question from Stefan here. Do you calculate the end fertilization also from an economic point of view? Prices have risen.
Yes.
It's certainly true.
Yes. So I didn't talk about this, but yes, the optimum, the recommendations in our current RB209 document is based on a particular break-even ratio. So that's a ratio of fertilizer price to grain price. The break-even ratio in RB209 at the moment is 5:1, but with the higher increases in fertilizer prices, we're seeing the break-even ratio has gone up last year up to about 10:1, which obviously has a massive impact on the amount of nitrogen you should apply to get an economic return. We have done a bit of work looking at oats and how high fertilizer prices have impacted oats. And we see that the response is a bit different to wheat and barley, but that, yes, as you see higher fertilizer prices, if the grain price isn't going up as well, then fertilizer rates should be reduced.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Prices for everything seem to have risen, and that's an important consideration. So
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
we're pretty much out of time here. So again, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation and discussion, and your information is there, of course. I'd just like to mention our next webinar. So I'm going to knock you off the screen.
Yeah.
And I will bring this up. Now, actually, for our next webinar, we don't have one set up yet, unfortunately. There are a couple of people we're talking to. However, if you would like to suggest a speaker, if one of you would like to speak yourself, please either contact Pablo Oliveira Firpo. His email is there on the screen, or me, Charlene White, and you can get a hold of me through the Oat newsletter, oatnewsletter@gmail.com, or there are other addresses listed on the oatnews.org site as well. Also, I will mention there is actually a link to the oat growth guide Sarah was talking about in the newsletter. And when I post the video, I will put another link to that as well. So with that, again, I'm going to say thank you very much, Sarah. Wonderful to have you. Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.